unmute myself. All right, welcome. First, I'm just going to start off by, I noticed that my internet looks a little slow right now, so if it gets choppy or messy, please let me know in the comments. Also, with comments, questions, please add them in there. I will get back to every question at the end. So add any question that pops up along the way. I'll get back to those at the end. Right. And like usual, this is being recorded, so anyone that's not able to make it, they will be able to come in and watch this at a later time. These are stored on YouTube, and that link is always available. Just want to start off with a quote on these. This is the same session I did last week. I'm going to run through it, very similar slide count, and then hopefully a little bit quicker than last week on Friday. Took a little bit longer than anticipated. So the goal is to turn data into information and information into insight. And I found this one to be perfect for CPI and what we're about to get into as directors. We want to take all that data we've collected and we want to gain insight on our players as directors, helping guide them to play in the right tiers and helping create the tiers at our events that they fit in best. So topics we'll cover today. Just do a quick introduction on CPI. We've done it a lot for directors. I just want to show directors where players can find that really easily. We can talk just briefly about where players are going to find how CPI is calculated. Show you where the players would find the CPI portion of the player's guide for them. Give them some great insights on what it means to have a CPI, what it means to not have a CPI. We'll talk about the two new tabs in the director's guide for CPI, one for USA directors and one a little more specific to Canada directors. We will then kind of discuss some of the flexibility around CPI and what flexibility we're going to have at the regional level. I'll go through the why on CPI, which I've covered before many times. I just want to kind of lay that out, kind of how CPI as a number is going to help us as directors get away from those players that maybe play intermediate too long and need to be moved up, help us avoid some of those conversations that aren't always easy, just by using a metric to push them up naturally. We'll look at a couple screenshots looking ahead of what registrations will look like later this week prior to them going live. Then I'll jump in and answer some questions that were answered last Friday and look for new questions this week. So again, if you have questions, please add them in the chat. And I will stay active on the chat and highlight all those questions at the end. Okay. First up, I'm not sure if you've been on your player app lately or you have seen players logging in. We have now moved CPI and PPR to a bigger, bolder box right on the home screen of the player app. This screenshot's from last week. We are currently actually on a newer version now. However, this all looks the same. The key thing here for players who are still learning about CPI, maybe they see their CPI for the first time and they log in and say, hey, oh wow, I've got a 6.11. You know, what does that mean? Or they log into their player app and they see a 0 for CPI and they want to know what that means. This little info button here will take them directly to the CPI guide that's geared towards players. Again, this is found in the player app, not on the director's side. So if players have questions, simply click on that button right there. What that's going to do is going to take them to the website, which simply iplaycornhole.com/CPI. Okay. When they get there, they will notice a new table of contents, which was just updated last Friday. And I think one of the important things there is right at the top when they're logged in, or I mean, when they go to the website, is what if I do not have a CPI, right? That's going to be the kind of the golden question for players that show a 0. What do I do if I do not have a CPI? And so that's right there at the top. We want those players to easily see, what to do if they do not have a CPI. So I'm going to go here to the website. You can see right at the top, what is cornhole performance, why, how's it calculated, all the answers here. But if we want to click on table of contents, what do I do if I do not have a CPI? It'll take us right to that spot. Okay. This is a few bullet points that I think are important for players to think about when they think about not having a CPI, and how to help guide them towards the right division prior to a director helping guide them. The first bullet point, use your points per round as a guide. So if players have a PPR in their head that they use at other local nights, other softwares, they can kind of use that as a gauge towards what CPI they might have. They can say, hey, am I a brand new player? Am I new to competitive cornhole? Then a good starting point is going to be around a 5. This is going to be kind of the intermediate, potentially novice area for new players, new to cornhole. Does that player have local experience, right? Are you playing on other softwares? Well, probably going to be suited most commonly for that 5 to 7 range, which is going to be our competitive, you know, high intermediate to competitive level. And then just a bullet point there to say, hey, my club director, my regional director, they may have access to some additional stats that I don't have. If I'm a player and I'm showing a 0 CPI, in fact, the directors may actually be able to see a CPI in the background that's building for that player. So kind of points them there. So just a few things I want to point out. If the players have questions, they're on their app, they click that info button, can really guide the player to answer some questions before we need to give them all of those answers. So that again, use that table of contents right there. All right, next, we've added a couple of new tabs for the directors. So this is now in the director's guide, which is also on the website, iplaycornhole.com/director-guide. This now has 2 new things here in the table of contents, which we will look at both of those. CPI for directors, and in the USA side and on the Canadian side. Show you on the director's guide real quick here. I'm logged into the director's guide on the website. 2 new tabs. The only reason we have a split between USA and Canadian directors is that the CPI metrics in each of the 2 countries is using a slightly different scale. So it's about the same percentages for their player base and our player base, or all the player bases worldwide. The percentages is staying very close to similar. But what we're seeing is that number of CPI changes whether you're a tier 3 player or tier 2 player in Canada versus the US. And so we want to keep those streamlined across the board for everyone. So if you click on that, take you all the way down. It's a long ways down. CPI for directors. Okay, we're going to talk about how we're structuring these different tiers. But before we get to that, another important thing, the very first thing you see is, what if a player does not have a CPI? Again, this is going to be a question that we're going to be answering kind of all season long, right? We're going to train ourselves how to answer it. We're going to train players how to help each other answer that question by guiding them through a series of questions. Now, I think these questions are very similar to how we would have guided a brand new player last year. If I was running a regional last season, had a brand new player come in, they did not have an ACL account, the question is still, hey, what do I sign up for? Do I sign up for intermediate? Do I sign up for this advanced level? What does open mean, right? And these are the same type of questions we'll be answering when it comes to CPI. And a player says, I don't know what CPI is. Where should I be playing, right? We're going to ask them some guiding questions by starting a conversation, finding out some of their experience. Last year, I would have asked a player, hey, do you play when you go camping with family? Have you thrown a bag in your backyard? Or is it that you're coming over from like a bar league where you have some experience throwing in a bar league? We're trying to kind of gauge what that player's experience level is to help guide them towards where we think they should play at our regionals. We can, use other metrics that might be on, other apps that they're playing with other directors on their Scoreholio app, right? If a player says, hey, I have a 7.1 PPR on my other league that I'm playing in, it's not ACL. How can I use a 7.1 PPR to determine where should we be playing in the CPI? If we know they have a 7.1 PPR, I kind of put a bullet point at the bottom here as a general guideline. Players PPR versus CPI. What we're seeing commonly is that a player's PPR is generally about 0.75 higher than their CPI. So if I have a 7.1 PPR, I might assume that I would generally have about a 6.5 CPI. Now that number is not across the board, but it's pretty generalized that way. Um, in the admin portal, we have some ways to see additional data. So if a player is being input into an event, that's going to be the first way we can see additional data is on the event side. And as we grow that into the admin portal, we'll have some additional tools where we can use player research tools to find information about players that may not have a CPI on their app, but they may have a CPI or other stats building from previous ACL games played. So, if a player comes to a local weeknight, maybe they come to 2 weeknights, right? And they play twice and they get talked into then showing up at the regional that weekend. If you go into the player's account and you search their name, you might see a CPI pop up right there. It says, 5.9 CPI. Now the player might still see a 0 because there are some requirements for the player to see a CPI. They need a certain amount of games. However, on the director side, we might see that CPI building prior to the player. So you might see a 5.9, and that might help guide you towards where the player is trending, although there may not be enough data to be accurate, but it's a start. It's a start for us. So just kind of keeping those kind of guiding questions in mind, the same similar guiding questions we would have asked last season. All right, back to this guy. So, if you have more specific questions about the CPI in the director's guide, I'm actually going to go back. I forgot I wanted to talk about this as well. So we set some national tiers, right? This is USA side. We did some for Canada as well. These tiers are what you will see at the ACL Open events, and these are an average of players across the entire country. So these are not the tiers we would expect to see necessarily at a regional, which might be quite a bit smaller. Okay, so use these guidelines as a tier at the national level. Just like last year, we were saying, hey, an advanced player PPR generally is about 8.1. Well, we know that didn't fit everywhere across the country, okay? And we know that these national CPI tiers are not going to fit at everyone's regional. These are national averages, and we want to kind of treat them that way. It's a baseline, okay? So we put in there, tier 3, for example. This is formerly competitive. We're kind of helping you understand where we were last year versus where we were this season. And we're seeing tier 3 players, 6.25 CPI, 7.25 CPI. So we have that lined out in the national section of the guide. Now, if we scroll down, we'll have some tiers lined out for state level events, which are very similar to national level events. And I'll scroll right past that and we'll look at regional events. Regional events, directors have an opportunity there to run 5 tiers, like you might find at a state event. It's a large regional. We have regional directors most commonly running 4 tiers, where they're kind of dropping off that lower tier, tier 1 through 4. And then you have some regional directors like myself last season, most commonly only running 3 tiers. And this is where I found my player base fits best. My regionals last season maybe had 50 players, sometimes 65 players total, only 30 teams and doubles at most of my regionals. So I was splitting into 3 tiers and kind of keeping those groupings. Last season, I will do most likely a similar thing this season. And we kind of split out what those CPIs have opportunity to change at those regional levels. So, a regional director running a tier 2, they might say, oh yeah, the tier 2 max at the national level is 8.25. That's too high for my area. I don't have very many players that high. I want to bring that down all the way down to 7.25, right? And so I'm setting my advanced level differently within a range of, 1 there. Differently than the national average. And I'm going to do that at my personal regionals as well. And we'll get a lot deeper into that on Wednesday and Friday as we go through some actual regional registration creations. But just to say, everyone's player base is not the same. And we don't expect it to be. It's just like last year with, I'd consider an intermediate player in my area, same as an intermediate player traveling to an ACL Open, right? That that's a big swing for some of these people. So we're allowing directors to have some swing there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. And then, of course, clubs will have some additional flexibility as well at smaller events. Back on the slideshow. So the next one here is just kind of showing you guys where the player base is at, kind of on a national average. And you can see that, tier one nationally is only covering 5% of the player base. And if I go to a regional, I surely don't only want 5% of the players playing in open at my regional, right? That's where that flexibility comes in. I can bring in this group of 10% and I can bring in some of this group here of 27% all into my open division at regionals, which we're now calling tier one. So just because the national average is this way does not mean we expect your regionals to only have 5% in tier one. That's flexible to you and building to what your player base is. I have a lot of players that want to play tier one, no matter their skill level. They prefer to play tier one, and I will help adjust that CPI to get those players playing up a little bit higher based on my smaller numbers. But this is the national numbers here. You can really see that tier three, tier four. This is the majority of all of our players. More than 60% of the players nationally fit into this range, and this is where we're gonna really want to make some adjustments as we learn about this player base. All right, another graph, same data here, no change on the data, just a different way to portray it. See that 5%, that small group there at the top, but the bulk of the players nationally with CPI is going to be found in these lower tier three, tier four, and tier five CPIs. So we want to make sure we're flexible for those players to make sure they fit into our regional and state events. All right, a couple different ways I want to show some flexibility. Again, this may not make perfect sense until we get into the registration creation. However, I want to show you, national numbers taking this whole entire bar. So, tier three, for example, this whole bar all the way up to 7.25. That's a national average tier three player. But what we're going to be able to do at regionals, we're going to be able to take this group of dark blue, and if that fits your player base, you're going to be able to move them up into the next tier up. So, for me, knowing that I don't have many players at all that are going to be 8.25 and higher, I'm able to move this dark blue group here up into tier one for my regional. I'll show you kind of here what that looks like. So at the regional level and even at the state level to some degree, you'll be able to move the higher end of each tier up and say like my, tier three event, if you're higher than a 6.25, you cannot play in tier three. Or at the national level, you can go all the way up to 7.25 and play in tier three. So got some flexibility there based on kind of what my players numbers are like. So kind of showing, here, this is where our flexibility comes in. If you're running 5 tiers and you want to move some people up, you feel like your player base is smaller, your numbers are a little bit lower, you can do that there. Okay. Now, a regional like I mentioned, where I might be running only 3 tiers, kind of running what was last year open, last year competitive, and intermediate. This year I'll be running tier 1, tier 3, and tier 4 of my regionals. And I can move a section of that player base up to make sure my tier 1 is still got a large group of players in it. Whoops. And that would look like this, right? I could take either this whole group, I could take half the group, I could take 3/4 of the group, have some flexibility there, move that group of players into tier 1 because I know that this group of players is not attending my tier 1. I just don't have that player base. So I'm not worried about someone has a 9.1 CPI coming in and beating all of these players. These players truly actually are my tier 1 or tier 2 level players. So hopefully that kind of makes a little sense there having a graph. All right. A couple of, examples here of some flexibility. If you recall, let's take this tier 2 example here. At the national level, tier 2 singles, max CPI is 8.25. I would have the opportunity to go down to a 7.5 if I wanted. I could even go down to 7.25, and I'll show you that a little bit more in depth on Wednesday, but we do have charts for that available for directors to see. And, if I went to a 3-tier system down at the bottom there, and I felt like, tier 3 at the national level is 6.25, or regional level for me. or it might be all the way up to 7.25 at the national level. So just kind of showing you some flexibility there. That's based on this group of players right here, that last one. All right. Want to go into, I know I'm talking quickly here. Again, keep the questions coming. I'll hit them all at the end. Um, want to talk a little bit again about why CPI, right? I've shown this specific diagram before. I just want to like dive into it to kind of hit home for us directors on a little bit more of the why. What we have here is player A, right? Player A has a 6.94 CPI. Last year, their skill level in their account showed advanced, and they shot 8.07 PPR. Now, as we look at the data, we can see that player, they have a negative DPR and they win less than half of their games. So, this might be telling me this player in the skill level advanced last year maybe was playing too high, right? And that 6.94, maybe they wanted to play higher, maybe they asked their director to move them to advanced. That's totally fine. They'll be able to play up this year as well. Okay, so nothing wrong with that. But what I'm seeing here is this player's losing more often than winning, right? I have another player, player B, who also has a 6.9 for CPI. So on the CPI scale, this is the same player. This player last year, they had a competitive skill level in their account. They did throw a 7.1 PPR, so a little bit lower than player A. They had a positive DPR and they were winning 20% more or 15% more than player A. They were winning a lot of games. Now, maybe this player came from winning a lot in intermediate and they recently got bumped up to competitive. That might be the story behind it. Maybe they're playing competitive in their area and they're winning too often. And they didn't want to have that tough conversation with their director about, hey, maybe you should be advanced now. So now, as a director, I could go in and set my tier three, which would be competitive CPI, have a max of 6.75. Now, guess what? Player B here would then have to be playing up and my regional, as long as we can see what's fair with setting that number. And then, of course, player C also had a 6.9 CPI. They were listed as intermediate last year, which is, one of those intermediate players that was throwing an 8 PPR, probably way too high for that division. They had a positive DPR and they were winning a whopping 71% of their games. So again, maybe the director did not want to have tough conversation with the player, said, hey, I want you to start playing competitive. They didn't want to move them up. Now with CPI, this player would then be playing other players with a similar CPI. So that's kind of the why behind it, kind of help us baseline these players, not have that 8 PPR playing an intermediate while winning 70% of their games. It's just not good for our players. All right, quick snapshot of what some registration is going to be looking like later this week, and I'm going to do a lot more deep dive into these as those are ready for us. But you'll see here, just like last year, you'd pick an event registration from the list. This one's tier one singles. We're going to have it listed there, formerly open. That way, directors are still clued in, kind of how things went last year. We'll have a default range set for everything when you go in there, and you'll have the ability to move that up to the national standard or even down a little bit below the default. Here in this case, this is tier one singles at an open, of course, I guess tier one's not a good example. This would be a tier two singles technically. At an open, tier two singles max would be 8.25, meaning anyone below 8.25 could not play tier two. Now we're going to have you preset here as a default on 7.75. So at your regional or your state event, any player under 7.75 as a default would not be able to play in your tier two, and then or anyone above. And then you could actually lower that down all the way to 7.25. So you have some flexibility there. That's what that's going to look like. We're going to try to keep some charts on the left while you're in registration just to help kind of guide directors on, kind of the averages and what we expect, and hope that state directors will kind of help guide their regional directors as well. Now, one thing we didn't talk about yet was blind draws, right? Directors have a lot of flexibility there as well. Most commonly, when someone runs a blind draw, they don't want players lower than that level playing up, and they don't want players higher playing down. So blind draws, you're able to set a minimum and a maximum kind of keep that competitive or tier three blind draw, if you will, with that same range of players. So we'd have some defaults there. If you go in and you select tier three blind draw, it's going to say formerly competitive to kind of help clue you in on that. You'll see there is a default minimum of 5.75 and a default maximum of 6.75. Both of those have flexibility. If you don't mind that players play up, you can put that minimum all the way down to 0, and people can play up in your blind draw. If you have to combine blind draws, you don't have enough people register, and you need to move that competitive tier three level up into tier two, you can certainly do that as well, making some adjustments there. So a lot of flexibility. A lot of that will make more sense in the next week or so as we're really diving into that and showing it a little bit closer in detail. And then, of course, as a team, all of us directors will be learning through October and through November together. We'll be, holding town halls on how we can make this make more sense, or what works for me, what's not working for me. Why is New York seems so different than Florida? Seems so different than Arizona. And so we'll be discussing that as a team and working through all that together. All right, some quick answers from questions that were asked on Friday. First one: do the current season stats hold the most weight in the CPI algorithm? Okay, that's a good question. I answer that not exactly. I think that the current season's stats that are holding into that player CPI is actually what's driving the change of CPI. So although those previous two seasons are likely weighted, as long as the player was playing a lot of cornhole, they're still weighted heavy from those two seasons. However, the driver of the change is what's happening now. So if a player is playing up higher now and they're winning, we're going to see it change in that CPI relatively quickly, because this is the season that they're currently in that's driving that change. This one: can we apply rules about max wins at certain levels? This is a great one. Stuff we ran into last year. Example: player with a 6.32 CPI wins tier three twice. Their CPI doesn't go up enough to force them up. What can we do as director? Okay, these are things we're going to talk about through the first 2 months of the season. We have some ideas, of how we can go in and mark a certain player to a certain tier. However, there's also downsides to that. So we want to make sure we get that right. And we're going to talk about that through the first 2 months of the season. Last year, if somebody came to my regional and they won intermediate singles twice, I would just simply go in and move them to competitive. Now they can't play intermediate anymore. So we want to make sure we have something similar along the lines with CPI that makes sense for everybody. That was the answer there. All right. In doubles, will a combined CPI be used for straight bracket play? Not yet. In doubles, what we're doing is a max CPI per player. So if the director says, hey, this tier three doubles event has a max CPI of 6.75, that's going to be each player. And so when a player goes into register on the registration page on their phone, they're going to see their own CPI. They type in their player's name for a doubles teammate, it's going to pop up. They're going to see their doubles teammate's CPI just to verify that both players are under the max. We're not getting into right away like setting like a 14 CPI that both players combined to be under 14. That's probably something we're going to get to at local events as the season moves on. We're starting out with just the same standard max CPI per player. All right, another one. Does a player with a current CPI face a disadvantage compared to a new player without one, since the old data may weigh them down? And I like that mindset. However, I think that what's actually going to happen is the new player is going to be the one that sees the most change, and they're going to be the one that still really is concerned about that change. And I think that having all that built data of 2 years, even though a player may be getting better currently, it's still going to be a better snapshot of really where that player's at. So I tend to think it goes both ways. I do think new players, if they see a larger fluctuation, may have more questions about the fluctuation than a player that has 2.5 years of data and is seeing incremental change. All right, and then this one kind of leads into that. What's the benefit of using 3 years or 2.5 years of data calculate CPI versus a snapshot in time like the last 120 days? And my thought there is definitely that 120 days is not really a true representation of that player. And what we don't want to do is get into a metric that is a snapshot of a player, not what we built over time of truly representing where that player plays. And so, CPI is not meant to be something that goes up and down like crazy every week. It's not meant to be something that you go to a local event with one CPI and you leave really frustrated because you just went down, 5.5 points by losing one game. That's not what CPI is about. CPI is really about building a true visual of that player over time, and that will change with the player over time and not be a snapshot of what maybe happened to start the season. And then what happens if a player registers for an event with one CPI, and then a few weeks later, that CPI is now out of range? This is another great question, something that we're all going to work through together. And regional directors may set a different stance on this, and that's okay. I think as long as we're talking about it together, talking about it with our players. Now, like I mentioned before, CPI is not going to have wild swings. So if I have a CPI skill division in singles, and I say, hey, no one with a 6.75 or higher can play tier 3, and someone registers 3 weeks in advance, they have 6.70. Okay. Now, 3 weeks later, all of a sudden, now they have 6.81 and it's time to play. What do I do as a director? Well, I've got some decisions to make, right? I'm going to be able to see that data in my registration. I can see all players' CPI. And so I'll have to make a decision with that player. Hey, 6.81, I see you're trending up. However, looking at the players playing in the division above you, I still am not sure that that fits. So I'm going to let you stay. But just know next time you'll have to play up if your CPI stays that way. Or a director could have more of a hard-nosed approach. Hey, you know what? Saying this to all my players across the board, it's a hard-nosed approach. If your CPI goes up at all, I'm going to go ahead and move you divisions, and that's okay too. Personally, I think that the change in CPI is not going to be great enough to where at my events it would make too much difference. However, you may feel different at your events. But that one's a great question. We will be talking about that all of October and certainly into November as a team. All of us directors, local, regional, state, everybody figure out what's best for that one because I really like that mindset, kind of where we're going in making CPI better for everybody. And there we go. I talked for 33 straight minutes. All right. Quickly, some final thoughts, and I'll run through the questions here. Final thoughts for me. CPI is a big change. Obviously, I think it's heading in the right direction of getting players out of the mindset of I'm an intermediate player, or I'm a competitive player, and they don't want to change. Okay. Really, as we're changing into this, I have on here directors equals advocates because that's what's going to make this change the most successful is when directors are advocating for a better division, a way to find skill divisions than what we had. And so as we have conversations like this one here is obviously a one-way conversation. I'm talking to you, but in the future, we're going to have two-way conversations where we are in a town hall together and discussing this as a team. And I think having advocates as directors on the side of CPI is going to make this transition so much smoother. So that's one thing I ask for as directors is be an advocate for CPI as we see this change and we learn together. Being an advocate is going to help this come through quite a bit smoother. All right, and Q&A. Let's go up here and look for a couple. First one from Kim, where can directors find the additional stats on the back end? Well, the first place you're going to look, just if you're talking about CPI, Kim, is just in the player search. CPI will be listed there. Even if they don't have one on the player app, they're going to have one in that player search. The first tool that's coming out for directors to use will be inside the event itself. So as players are getting added to an event, there will be a player research tab inside the event. And that player research tab will have a whole host of events based on that player's ACL history and not pertains to that particular event. Going forward from that, there will be a player research tab in the dropdown of the admin portal. That one's been a little bit more difficult to get coded into that section. So we're starting with it in the event side where you'll see tons of data based on players, not from that event stats, but their career stats and their history stats. Can we pull report of CPIs per club and per state? Um, the simple answer is yes. Well, I guess maybe not so simple because you're talking about pulling a report. We're going to have standings per club on CPI, standings per state on CPI, where you can just go to the website and anyone, players, directors, everyone can see those standings. But as far as pulling specific reports, the first report those will be pulled for is that weekly bag tracker. Those are going to be starting to be separated by state and show additional information next to each player. So you can sort by state, you can sort by PPR, you can sort by director and see, where my players versus other players in the state. So there'll be some multiple ways to do that. Pulling one specific report, I'm not sure if I have a clear answer for that one. Next one from Kim. Appreciate all the questions. These are all really good. Can we still do rounders in the double elimination brackets based on PPR at regionals? You can absolutely still do rounders and split those brackets, whichever way you want, whether you want to do win-loss, points, PPR, or even CPI. So if it's something you want to do, you just want to get everyone together, you want to run rounders and you're still going to split on CPI, that'll be an option. If you did these rounders last year where you said, hey guys, your PPR is really important in these rounders based on where you want to play, you can still sort and split into brackets based on PPR, yes. The players that only play at regionals and locals have an advantage of not being moved up as they should be if they were playing more heavily weighted events. Um, A little bit, but only at the highest end. So, what you're going to find of someone that only plays at regionals and locals and they don't go to opens is going to become very difficult for that player to get into that higher echelon of the top players that we see with those 9 CPIs and higher. There's only a few hundred players in the country that have higher than a 9 CPI, and none of those players, and that, I shouldn't say none. I don't expect really any of those players to be players that play at regionals only. Just because that open win and playing against other players with that high of CPI is really what's carrying them higher. So you'll definitely find regional players getting into the 8s for sure. Absolutely. If you're throwing a 9 PPR and you're winning at regionals, you're definitely getting into the 8s on the CPI, no question. It's just going to be very, very difficult for you to get into the 9s and higher in the CPI without playing tougher competition at higher weighted events versus better players. Yep. So this one kind of the same thing. Yeah. So that's something we're definitely talking through the first couple of months. Like I mentioned, player B wins multiple regionals. Their CPI is not going up. Their CPI is definitely going to be going up playing and winning at regionals based on that level. They're all kind of geared together. So if you're winning competitive and you're in that 6 range, you're going to see that 6 tick up. Now, what you won't see is someone who wins a ton of competitive events all season. You won't see them getting into the high 8s and 9s. It's just not possible. But what you will see is that player that's winning too much at that tier 3, their CPI is going up high enough to kick them out of that tier 3. How quickly? We don't know the answer to that yet. How many games are they playing that weekend will matter, right? If they play in a bracket of 6, that's probably not going to be a great gauge. If they play in a bracket of 12, it's going to be a lot better gauge. If they play in a bracket of 25 players, an even better gauge. And so, number of games obviously will matter in that as well. Will their CPI be the topic of the first player town hall? Yep, I assume that CPI will be the topic of many of the first town halls. And yes, I'm super excited. I didn't do a screenshot there. I think Todd shared like a blurred out version of the screenshot. The player research tab. I haven't seen it in live real time, but I'm super excited for that. Just as a director, I really like to know where my players are at, and so being able to research players that have played in my events, players are in my events, or just as a general go looking at this player across the country and seeing research. Super exciting. And this one, yeah, I believe that, yes, the plan is to have an export tab, export on the standings tab and export for the states and whatnot to see where everyone's going. And we'll be sharing that. More data we get, the more we're sharing. So we're not trying to keep any data from anybody. The power is in the data. And what that data is going to do, just like that kind of quote ahead at the beginning, right? It's going to provide us insights, and we really want directors to have those insights. I don't want to hold on to that. I don't want to be the key of all the insights. I want all directors to have the insights. And yep, cool, great. This one is about 12 minutes quicker than the last one, so that's good. If you guys have any questions, keep throwing them in there. I can answer those. I want to, thank you guys all for joining this. Like I said, on Wednesday, I'm going to do one a lot more specific to creating a regional registration. And then Friday, I want to create some real regional registrations in real time with directors. And just have us all walk through that together and kind of see what I'm thinking for mine. Like I mentioned, my area is smaller than maybe what you might see in Virginia or some of the larger. And so I'm just curious, what directors are thinking early in their head, what I'm thinking, and how we can kind of collaborate and make that regional experience the best for all the players. All right. Sweet. Thanks, guys. Appreciate y'all. Have a good one, and hopefully we get you in on Wednesday and Friday. Bye.